Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Section 1. The disastrous debut of the lemon sorbet hat. Agatha Raisin stared into her hallway mirror and decided that life, collectively, had a grudge against her. It wasn't enough that she had retired early from a blazing par career in London, trading power lunches for middle-aged spread and cutthroat competition for the passive, aggressive tyranny of the Carsley Ladies' Society. No, today, the universe had struck a blow directly at her vanity. Her hair, usually a sleek, expensive salon, maintained blonde bob, was currently suffering from the aftermath of an experimental, volumizing treatment at a new place in Evesham. It looked less like Kate Moss and more like a dehydrated dandelion. And today was the Carsley Open Gardens Day. In a desperate, last-minute bid to conceal the disaster, Agatha had unboxed an impulse purchase from a boutique in Broadway, a wide-brimmed structured hat in a shade the saleswoman had called ethereal lemon. Standing in her dim hallway, Agatha realized it looked less like high fashion and more like she was wearing a giant, inverted lemon sorbet. She adjusted the monstrous brim, winced as a loose bobby pin stabbed her scalp, and lit a cigarette with an aggressive flick of her lighter. "Right," she muttered to her reflection, applying another layer of defiant crimson lipstick. "It's a statement piece. They won't be looking at my hair. They'll be too busy being intimidated by my fashion-forwardness." She didn't believe herself for a second. Agatha marched out of her cottage, locking the oak door with unnecessary force. Her garden, to her frustration, looked immaculate. She had paid a handsome sum to a brooding, silent man from the next village to ensure her delphiniums were taller than Mrs. Bloxby's, and that not a single weed dared to show its face. The village of Carsley was already swarming with tourists and locals holding crumpled maps. It was a picturesque tableau of Cotswold stone, creeping wisteria, and simmering social rivalry. The hum of polite conversation was thick in the air, but Agatha knew that beneath the compliments about petunias lay a brutal caste system based on soil acidity and rose pruning. She began her ascent toward the upper end of the village, aiming for the grand gates of Croft Manor. The manor garden was always the centerpiece of the Open Gardens Day, a sprawling, aristocratic contrast to the tightly packed cottage plots below. But today the manor held a grim fascination beyond its herbaceous borders. Sir Gerald Croft, the curmudgeonly, exceedingly wealthy patriarch, who had owned half the parish, had died 3 days prior. It had been a scandalous, inconvenient death, collapsing right into a bed of his prize-winning iceberg roses during a heated argument with his landscape architect over the placement of a folly. Agatha had found the news moderately irritating. Death was so depressing, and it always cast a pall over social events. However, her annoyance had transformed into sharp curiosity when the village grapevine, currently spearheaded by the tireless Mrs. Wong at the post office, began buzzing with rumours of a missing final will. Agatha sniffed the air as she passed Mrs. Bloxby's gate. The vicar's wife was pruning a rogue vine. "Good morning, Agatha," Mrs. Bloxby called out, her expression a heroic battle to maintain neutrality as she took in the lemon sorbet hat. "A striking accessory. It's from a boutique in Broadway." Agatha snapped defensive immediately. "Very in vogue. Shame about Sir Gerald, isn't it? Though I suppose at his age, dropping dead is almost expected." Mrs. Bloxby winced slightly at Agatha's bluntness. It was very sudden. Poor Doris is in quite a state. Doris Croft was Sir Gerald's sister, a fluttery, downtrodden woman who had spent her life under his thumb. "I hear the village is in a lather about the will," Agatha said, leaning over the wall, ignoring the fact that her hat was now dipping into a climbing rose. "It is unsettling," Mrs. Bloxby admitted, her voice lowering. "The solicitors were due yesterday to read the final testament, but it appears they only have the penultimate version from 10 years ago. Apparently, Sir Gerald drafted a new one just last week, but it's nowhere to be found in the manor." "Stolen?" Agatha asked, her eyes narrowing. "Doris is hoping it is merely mislaid," Mrs. Bloxby said softly. "The old will leaves almost everything to a distant cousin in Australia Sir Gerald hadn't spoken to in decades. This new will was rumoured to change things considerably." Agatha felt a familiar buzz of excitement a phantom echo of her PR days when a client faced a hostile takeover. Gossip was one thing, a mystery involving a massive inheritance, a dead aristocrat, and a missing document was quite another. It almost made her forget about her terrible hair. "Well," Agatha declared, adjusting her hat with a sharp tug, "I'm going up to pay my respects and to see the roses, of course." She marched away before Mrs. Blocksby could caution her against being nosy. As she walked up the drive to Croft Manor, the atmosphere changed. The tourists were quieter here, peering at the stone facade with a mixture of reverence and morbid curiosity. The manor grounds were extensive, a testament to old money and a ruthlessly managed estate. Agatha spotted the suspect iceberg rose bed, now roped off with a small, pathetic little sign that read, "Out of respect." On the terrace stood James Lacey, Agatha's neighbour and the object of her intense, though often frustrating, affection. He looked impossibly handsome in a linen jacket, talking to a weeping woman who could only be Doris Croft. James caught sight of Agatha. His eyebrows shot up so high they almost met his receding hairline. He stared at the lemon sorbet hat with undisguised horror. Agatha's heart did its usual inconvenient flop, quickly followed by a surge of humiliation. She saw James whisper something to Doris and then detach himself, walking toward Agatha with the brisk stride of a man who would rather be facing a firing squad. "Agatha," James said, his voice strained. What is that on your head?" "It's a hat, James. Don't be a peasant," Agatha snapped, her face flushing crimson to match her lipstick. "I'm here for the open gardens, to support the community. Unlike some people who seem to be using it as an opportunity for social climbing with the newly bereaved." James stared at her, seemingly at a loss for words, his gaze glued to the enormous yellow brim. He opened his mouth, but before he could deliver whatever devastating critique was brewing, the quiet air was shattered. A scream, high and terrified, rang out from inside the manor. It was followed by the crashing sound of something heavy hitting the floor. James and Agatha exchanged a look, Agatha's embarrassment instantly replaced by adrenaline. Ignoring the startled gasps of the tourists on the lawn, they both ran toward the manor's open French windows. Section 2. Dust, deception, and a ruined Ming vase. Agatha burst through the French windows with all the subtlety of a charging rhinoceros, nearly decapitating herself as the lemon sorbet hat collided violently with the doorframe. The impact knocked the monstrosity askew, but there was no time for vanity. She shoved it back into place and practically trampled James Lacey to get to the source of the scream. They found Mrs. Hodges, the manor's longtime housekeeper, slumped against the mahogany doorframe of Sir Gerald's private study, clutching her chest and emitting short, high-pitched wheezes. Agatha pushed past the trembling woman and stopped dead. The study, usually a dark, oppressive shrine to leather, bound volumes and taxidermy, looked as though it had been subjected to a localized hurricane. Books were swept off the shelves, their spines cracked against the Persian rug. The drawers of the massive oak desk had been pulled out and unceremoniously dumped. In the center of the room lay the shattered remains of a blue and white porcelain vase, its water and ruined peonies soaking into the antique wool. Most damning of all, an oil painting of a rather sullen-looking spaniel had been swung aside, revealing a small wall safe. The heavy metal door hung wide open. It was completely empty. He was here. "Mrs." Hodges wailed, pointing a trembling, flour-dusted finger toward the open window at the far end of the room. "A phantom, a shadow. It flew right past me and out the glass." "Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Hodges. Ghosts don't rifle through filing cabinets," Agatha snapped, her dark eyes darting around the wreckage. She stepped carefully over a decapitated peony, her mind racing. The missing will. Someone had panicked. "I merely came in to draw the blinds," Mrs. Hodges sobbed, turning to James for sympathy, instinctively knowing he would provide it. "And the room was destroyed. Then a figure in black vaulted over the sill." I screamed and I dropped my feather duster. Before James could offer a soothing platitude, heavy frantic footsteps echoed in the corridor. Julian Croft, Sir Gerald's nephew, and a man whose tailored tweed suits could not quite hide his perpetual air of financial desperation, skidded into the doorway. "Good God!" Julian gasped, surveying the chaotic room. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. What on earth has happened here? I heard a scream. Agatha turned her shrewd gaze upon him. Julian was breathing heavily, a fine sheen of sweat glistening on his upper lip, but it was his clothes that caught her attention. There was a thick smudge of grey dust across his right lapel, and a distinct cobweb clinging desperately to his elbow. "Where were you just now, Julian?" Agatha asked, her voice carrying the sharp, authoritative edge she used to reserve for underperforming junior PR executives. Julian blinked, his eyes darting toward the empty safe before snapping back to Agatha. I was downstairs, in the cellar, checking the vintage claret. Uncle Gerald was very particular about the temperature." Agatha stared at him. The lie was so poorly constructed, it was almost insulting. The manor's cellar was famously damp and pristine, maintained by a climate control system Sir Gerald had installed at great expense. It certainly did not feature the sort of dry, feathery cobwebs that currently adorned Julian's arm, cobwebs that looked suspiciously similar to those lingering in the uppermost corners of the study's bookshelves. Checking the claret, Agatha repeated slowly, letting the silence stretch into an uncomfortable, agonizing void. "How very diligent of you, especially given the circumstances." "Yes, well," Julian stammered, pulling at his collar. He aggressively brushed the cobweb from his elbow, realizing his mistake a second too late. "Someone has to maintain order. Step aside, please." A new, authoritative voice called out from the hallway. Agatha sighed inwardly. It was Detective Constable Bill Wong, looking exasperated and far too young to be dealing with the likes of Julian Croft. Bill squeezed past the weeping housekeeper, took one look at the destroyed study, and groaned. "Right, nobody touch anything," Bill commanded, pulling out his notebook. He spotted Agatha, and his shoulders slumped slightly. "Agatha, why am I not surprised to find you standing in the middle of a potential crime scene?" "I am a guest, Bill," Agatha said, drawing herself up to her full height, which was somewhat undermined by the precarious tilt of the yellow hat. "James and I heard the scream. We were being civic-minded." "Be civic-minded in the hallway, please," Bill said firmly, gesturing toward the door. "I need to secure the room." Agatha opened her mouth to argue, pride stinging at being dismissed like an overeager schoolgirl, but a sharp tug on her arm from James pulled her backward. "Come along, Agatha," James muttered. "Let the police do their job." Reluctantly, Agatha allowed herself to be led into the corridor, but as she walked away, her mind was buzzing louder than the Carsley Ladies' Society at a charity bake sale. Julian Croft was lying through his aristocratic teeth. The safe was empty, and Agatha Raisin was absolutely, undeniably on the case. Section 3. Gossip at the Red Lion and a pint of bitter. An Agatha Raisin mystery. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Cotswold stone as Agatha and James stepped away from Croft Manor. The tourists were still milling about the gardens, blissfully unaware that a second, far more dramatic crime had just taken place a few yards away. Agatha yanked the lemon sorbet hat from her head, vowing secretly to feed it to the village compost heap the moment she got home, and ran a hand through her unfortunate dandelion. "Like hair. I need a drink," she announced, her voice flat and decisive, "and not tea. Real, alcoholic, throat-burning gin." James cast a sidelong glance at her. "It is barely past midday, Agatha, and you heard Bill Wong. The police are going to be asking questions." "Let them," Agatha snapped, pivoting sharply on her heel and heading down the lane toward the village centre. Bill Wong wouldn't know a clue if it bit him on his baby-faced nose. "Did you see Julian?" Sweating through his tweed, covered in cobwebs from the top shelf, swearing he was down in the cellar checking claret. The man looked like he'd just wrestled a chimney sweep. He was shaken up, James offered mildly, adjusting his stride to match hers. "His uncle just died. His uncle should have left him penniless, which is precisely why the will is missing," Agatha shot back. "Julian is drowning in debts. I saw the way he looked at the safe. It wasn't grief, James. It was panic." James didn't answer, but his silence suggested he wasn't entirely writing off her theory. Instead of going straight home, Agatha marched straight into the Red Lion, the local pub. It was cool, dim, and smelled pleasantly of old oak, stale beer, and damp wool. At this hour it was mercifully quiet, save for old Bertie, who was nursing a pint in the corner and snoring softly into his beard. They claimed a sticky wooden table near the window. James went to the bar, returning a moment later with a gin and tonic for Agatha and a pint of bitter for himself. Agatha took a long, restorative gulp of her drink, the ice clinking against the glass. The alcohol hit her bloodstream and immediately began soothing her ruffled pride and agitated nerves. "So," James said, sitting down and wrapping his long fingers around his glass. "Suppose you're right. Suppose Julian broke into his uncle's safe. What was he looking for? The new will, obviously," Agatha said, leaning forward across the table, her dark eyes flashing with competitive fire. Sir Gerald was a spiteful old goat. He probably threatened to cut Julian off entirely, or worse, leave the estate to the National Trust. Julian finds out, goes looking for the document to destroy it, and lo and behold, Summoning beats him to it, or he trashed the study looking for it before Mrs. Hodges caught him, or, a dry voice chimed in from behind them, someone else had the exact same idea. Agatha jumped, nearly spilling her gin. Mrs. Blocksby stood by their table, holding a small basket of local jam she must have picked up from the parish stall. She looked serene, but her eyes held a spark of knowing amusement. "May I?" she asked, already sliding onto the bench opposite James without waiting for an invitation. "Do sit down, Vicar's wife," Agatha said, recovering quickly and smoothing down her blouse. "You look like you've heard something juicy. Spill." Mrs. Blocksby smiled faintly. "I simply stopped by the post office to mail a letter. Mrs. Wong is running a quite impressive rumour mill. Apparently, Julian Croft isn't the only one with a motive." "Oh," James prompted. "Indeed," Mrs. Blocksby said, leaning in. "Doris Croft, poor, fluttery Doris, isn't nearly as meek as she lets on. The local chemist mentioned that she ordered a rather large quantity of sleeping draughts last month. And then there is the landscape architect, Marcus Vance. He and Sir Gerald had a massive screaming match on the lawn just an hour before Sir Gerald collapsed." Agatha's eyes widened. "A screaming match about what? Money, creative differences, boundary lines. Take your pick," Mrs. Blocksby replied smoothly. "Marcus Vance is charm personified, but he has expensive tastes and a string of failed businesses in Cheltenham. If Sir Gerald refused to pay him for that ridiculous folly, Marcus's landscaping firm would go under." Agatha sat back, tapping a crimson, nailed finger against her glass. 3 suspects already: the desperate nephew, the meek sister with a secret stash of sleeping pills, and the aggressive landscape architect with a failing business. "And the missing will ties them all together," Agatha murmured, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Because whoever killed Sir Gerald, or at least benefited from his sudden demise, needs that document to disappear before it sees the light of day." James looked at her, a mixture of exasperation and reluctant admiration in his eyes. "Agatha, leave it to the police. Bill Wong is handling it." "Bill Wong," Agatha scoffed, finishing her gin with a decisive crunch of ice, "is currently staring at a broken Ming vase and wondering which end of a magnifying glass to look through. No, James, Carsley is my village now, and if there is a murderer running around it, they are going to find out that Agatha Raisin is far more dangerous than any ghost." Section 4, The Landscape Architect, and the poisoned petunias and Agatha Raisin mystery. The following morning, the village of Carsley hummed with a different kind of energy. The tourist crowds of the Open Gardens Day had vanished, leaving behind the heavy, suffocating silence of a community holding its collective breath. Gossip didn't just travel down the lanes, it seemed to seep out of the very stonework. Agatha woke up with a mild gin hangover, a lingering resentment toward her dandelion textured hair, and an absolute unshakable conviction that she was the only person in Oxfordshire possessing any common sense. By 10 o'clock she had fortified herself with 3 cups of strong black coffee, applied a defensive layer of makeup, and marched straight toward the southern edge of the village, where Croft Manor's sprawling grounds met the public bridleway. Her target was Marcus Vance, the landscape architect, whose screaming match with the late Sir Gerald Croft had set the village gossip mill spinning on overdrive. Marcus's temporary headquarters, a sleek, black mobile office trailer that looked thoroughly out of place amidst the historic charm of the Cotswolds, was parked just outside the manor's perimeter gate. Agatha strode up the aluminum steps, didn't bother to knock, and shoved the door open. Marcus Vance was leaning over a drafting table, examining a blueprint. He looked up, startled. He was a tall, tanned man in his late 40s with sun-streaked hair, wearing an unbuttoned linen shirt that reeked of expensive cologne and an aura of forced casualness. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced charm, though his eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Agatha's severe expression. "If you're looking to redesign your herbaceous borders, my diary is booked solid through autumn." "I don't need a border redesign, Mr. Vance," Agatha snapped, letting the door slam shut behind her with a sharp bang. She strode right up to the table, planting her hands firmly on its surface. "I need answers." Marcus blinked, leaning back and crossing his arms. A slow, knowing smile crept across his lips. "Ah, you're the local busybody I've heard about. Mrs. Raisin, isn't it? The one who lives down the lane and wears interesting headwear." Agatha felt her face flush hot with fury. "Never you mind my hats. Let's talk about your lungs, Mr. Vance. Specifically, how loudly you were screaming at Sir Gerald Croft right before he conveniently dropped dead in his rosebed." The smooth charm vanished from Marcus's face, replaced by a sudden, hard glint. He stood up straight, towering over her. "Sir Gerald and I had a professional disagreement. Wealthy men often think they can hire and fire at whim, without paying for materials already ordered. It was an argument about a garden folly. It has nothing to do with his death. People don't usually collapse from heart attacks just because someone disagrees about a Greek temple made of faux limestone." Agatha shot back, stepping closer, refusing to cower. "And they certainly don't have their safes burgled the very next day, unless there's a financial incentive involved, like a will. A missing will that might have cut out greedy relatives and aggressive contractors." Marcus let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "A missing will? Is that what the village gossips are chattering about now? Look, Mrs. Raisin, Sir Gerald was a miserable old tyrant who owed me £4,000 for stone masonry. If anyone had a motive to wish him out of the picture, it was his spineless nephew Julian, who needs money to pay off his London gambling debts, or his sister, Doris, who lived like a Victorian prisoner." "I've already spoken to Julian," Agatha lied smoothly, narrowing her eyes. "He blames you, and Mrs. Hodges says you looked desperate." Marcus's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched near his left eye. For a split second, the polished facade cracked entirely, revealing a man under immense, suffocating pressure. He reached down, grabbed a rolled-up set of blueprints, and shoved them into a cardboard tube with unnecessary violence. "I have a business to run," Marcus said coldly, stepping toward the door and holding it open for her. "And police officers have already been by to ask questions. Real police, not self-appointed village sleuths. I suggest you take your PR nose back to your cottage before you step into something you can't handle." Agatha glared at him, refusing to budge for a long moment. She committed every detail to memory: the expensive watch on his wrist that looked far too flashy for a struggling landscaper, the subtle tremor in his fingers, and the way he carefully avoided looking at a locked metal filing cabinet in the corner of the trailer. "This isn't over, Mr. Vance," Agatha said, sweeping past him with as much dignity as her height and stiff posture could muster. She marched down the metal steps and away from the trailer, her mind racing. Marcus was hiding something, that much was obvious. But as she reached the edge of the lane, she noticed something odd. Parked a short distance away, half concealed by an overgrown hedgerow, was a dark sedan. In the driver's seat sat Doris Croft, staring intently at Marcus's trailer through a pair of heavy binoculars. Agatha stopped dead in her tracks. The meek, fluttery sister of the deceased was spying on the landscape architect. Carsley was turning out to be a nest of vipers, and Agatha intended to expose every last one of them. Section 5. The Tea Party and the Stolen Spoon, an Agatha Raisin Mystery. The Carsley Ladies' Society Monthly. Tea Party was traditionally an exercise in passive, aggressive warfare disguised as sponge cake appreciation. But today, the atmosphere inside the village hall was less like a polite gathering and more like a pre-trial hearing. Agatha arrived fashionably late, purposely aiming to make an entrance. This time she had forgone the catastrophic lemon sorbet hat in favor of a sharp, tailored emerald blazer that screamed city sophistication and dared anyone to comment on her dandelion-textured hair. As she walked through the double doors, the ambient chatter dropped several decibels. Every eye in the room flicked toward her. Village news travelled faster than broadband, and by now half of Carsley knew Agatha had been snooping around Croft Manor and cornering Marcus Vance in his mobile trailer. Mrs. Bloxby, presiding over the silver teapot with saintly patience, offered a tight, knowing smile. But it was Mrs. Margaret Darby, a woman whose face resembled a dried apricot and whose tongue was sharper than a surgical scalpel, who struck first. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Margaret announced loudly from the corner table, her voice carrying across the hall. "We thought perhaps you'd moved into the manor, Agatha, given how much time you're spending sniffing around crime scenes, though I suppose former PR executives do love a scandal when their own lives lack excitement." A ripple of nervous, muffled laughter swept through the room. Agatha felt her temper flare instantly, hot and bright. She forced her lips into a tight, frosty smile and glided across the room, stopping right beside Margaret's table. "My life is plenty exciting, Margaret. Thank you very much," Agatha retorted, her voice dropping into a dangerous, clipped register. "At least I don't spend my afternoons counting other people's silverware or spreading malicious fabrications about who ordered sleeping draughts from the chemist." Margaret's eyes widened like two poached eggs in a snowbank, and a collective gasp echoed around the room. A stray biscuit clattered onto a saucer. Bingo, Agatha thought inwardly. The chemist rumour she had heard from Mrs. Bloxby was clearly true, and Margaret's reaction confirmed she was one of its primary authors. Before Margaret could formulate a counterattack, the side door clicked open, and Doris Croft stepped into the hall. The contrast was startling. Only 3 days after her brother's sudden death, Doris looked remarkably composed, perhaps too composed. She wore a modest black dress, but her hair was immaculately coiffed, and she carried herself with an unfamiliar rigidity, as if she had finally shed a heavy, invisible coat. Instantly, the room shifted focus. Whispers buzzed like angry hornets. Doris hesitated by the door, blinking against the sudden attention, before her gaze locked onto Agatha. To everyone's utter astonishment, Doris walked straight toward her. "Agatha," Doris said, her voice trembling only slightly. Might I have a word with you in private?" Margaret Darby looked as though she might swallow her own dentures out of sheer shock. Agatha stared at Doris, completely taken aback, but recovered her poise quickly. "Of course, Doris. Let's step outside into the courtyard," Agatha replied, linking her arm through the other woman's with proprietary authority, acutely aware of every single pair of eyes boring into their backs as they exited. The gravel courtyard behind the village hall was quiet, shaded by an old oak tree. Doris released a long, shaky breath, clutching her handbag tightly against her chest. "I saw you yesterday," Doris whispered, looking down at the stones, "outside Marcus Vance's trailer, and I know you've been asking questions about Gerald's will." Agatha kept her expression neutral, adopting her best professional listener pose. "People are talking, Doris. When a wealthy man dies under eccentric circumstances and his final legal documents vanish into thin air, the village naturally gets curious." "It hasn't vanished," Doris murmured, lifting her eyes. There was a desperate hard edge to them now. "Gerald didn't lose the new will. I took it." Agatha's eyebrows shot up. The confession hung in the warm afternoon air, heavy and startling. "You took it," Agatha repeated, keeping her voice steady. "Why on earth would you steal your own brother's will?" "Because he was going to destroy it," Doris said, her voice cracking with suppressed fury and years of accumulated bitterness. "For 40 years I looked after him. I cooked, I cleaned, I managed the estate while he played the lord of the manor. And a month ago he promised, he swore, he was leaving Carsley Manor to me, all of it, to secure my future." She gripped her handbag tighter, knuckles turning white. "Then last week we had a terrible row. He found out I had been corresponding with a solicitor behind his back. He laughed in my face. Agatha, he told me he changed his mind, that he was leaving everything to that ungrateful cousin in Australia, to spite me. I went into his study while he was out, opened the safe, and took the new draft before he could burn it. And the day he died, Agatha asked softly. Were you in the study when the safe was emptied again? Doris shook her head vehemently. No. When I went back yesterday to put the draft safely away, someone had already broken in. The safe was wide open, and the document was gone. Agatha stared at her, her mind racing. Doris had motive, yes, but she was just as shocked by the second break in as everyone else, which meant someone else had beaten both Doris and Julian to the punch. And as Agatha watched Doris dab a tear from her eye, a cold, chilling realization settled over her. The killer wasn't just hiding a motive. They were actively hunting down the only piece of paper that could expose the truth. Section 6. Secrets under polite smiles and Agatha Raisin mystery. The heavy oak door of the village hall clicked shut behind them, cutting off the murmur of repressed gasps and clinking tea saucers. Agatha stood in the cool shade of the courtyard, staring at Doris Croft. The fluttery, helpless facade was entirely gone, replaced by the taut, brittle energy of a woman pushed past her breaking point. You realize, Agatha said carefully, her mind racing to connect the pieces, that by admitting you took the draft, you've basically painted a gigantic target on your own back. If Bill Wong finds out, Bill Wong is a polite boy who believes everyone in Oxfordshire is fundamentally decent. Doris interrupted, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. He doesn't know what it's like to live under Gerald's thumb for 4 decades. Every penny I spent, every friend I invited over, every breath I took had to be justified. When he told me he was cutting me out of the will after all, something inside me just snapped. So you stole the draft, Agatha mused, tapping a fingernail against her chin. But when you went back yesterday to secure it, the safe was already cleaned out. Someone beat you to it. Yes, Doris whispered, her eyes widening with genuine, lingering fear. And it wasn't Julian. Julian is too cowardly to break a window, let alone pick a lock. Whoever got into that safe knew exactly what they were looking for. Agatha crossed her arms, her emerald blazer tightening across her chest as she stared past Doris at the rolling hills in the distance. The web was tightening. Sir Gerald had changed his will to cut out Doris, leaving everything to an Australian cousin. Doris had stolen that draft. Marcus Vance had been screaming at Sir Gerald over thousands of pounds in unpaid stone, masonry. Julian Croft was drowning in gambling debts, and somewhere out there, a 4th person had sneaked into the manor study, smashed a Ming vase, and stolen the document right out from under everyone's noses. Tell me, Doris, Agatha said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Did anyone else know about the new will? Did Sir Gerald consult a local solicitor, or did he draft it himself? Doris hesitated, swallowing hard. He used a firm in Cheltenham, Holloway and Briggs, but he also kept a notebook on his desk where he jotted down legal notes. A black leather-bound ledger. A ledger, Agatha repeated, a triumphant spark igniting in her dark eyes, which wasn't in the study when Bill Wong processed the crime scene. I didn't see any black ledger on that desk. Before Doris could reply, the door to the hall creaked open. Margaret Darby peered out, her face pinched with aggressive curiosity. Doris, Agatha, we're cutting the Victoria sponge, and if you miss it, Mrs. Bloxby will assume you've defected. We're coming, Margaret, Agatha called back, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She turned back to Doris. Keep quiet about this. Don't say a word to Bill Wong, and for heaven's sake, stop spying on Marcus Vance with binoculars. It looks dreadful, Doris nodded dumbly, clutching her handbag like a shield, and scurried back into the hall. Agatha lingered in the courtyard for a moment, pulling a silver cigarette case from her handbag. She tapped a cigarette against the metal, clicked her lighter, and took a long, meditative drag. The smoke curled up into the Cotswold's air, mixing with the scent of cut grass. Her PR instincts were screaming at her. In a crisis, people always tried to control the narrative. But here, they weren't just controlling a narrative, they were concealing financial ruin. 10 minutes later, Agatha re-entered the hall, determined to grab her handbag and make a strategic retreat. But as she stepped toward her chair, she found her path blocked by James Lacey. He was holding a small plate with a crumbling slice of sponge cake, looking distinctly out of place among the cluster of chattering villagers. "You missed the cake," James said, raising an eyebrow. "And more importantly, you missed Margaret Darby speculating that you and Doris Croft are hatching a plot to flee to the Costa del Sol." "Margaret Darby can choke on her sponge cake," Agatha snapped, though the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally at the sight of him. "I've been having a very productive conversation," Doris confessed. James paused, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. "Confessed to the murder." "To taking the will draft," Agatha corrected, lowering her voice so the nearby cluster of village gossips couldn't overhear. "And more importantly, she mentioned a missing black ledger, a legal notebook Sir Gerald kept on his desk." "It's gone, James. Someone didn't just steal the will. They stole the record of who knew about it." James stared at her, his grey eyes searching her face. For a fleeting second, there was no irritation in his gaze, only a deep, piercing attentiveness that made Agatha's heart do an unauthorized, clumsy flip. "Agatha," James said quietly, his voice losing its usual teasing edge, "you are playing a very dangerous game. This isn't a PR campaign gone wrong, where a client loses a contract. Someone died, and whoever took that ledger is hiding something major." "Let them hide," Agatha retorted, her pride flaring up to mask the sudden flutter in her chest, "because Agatha Raisin is about to smoke them out." Section 7. Personal stakes rise an Agatha Raisin mystery. The following morning dawned grey and drizzly, casting a dismal slate-coloured pall over the postcard, "Perfect Cottages of Carsley." Agatha woke up feeling distinctly uncooperative. The damp English weather had wreaked absolute havoc on her hair, turning the experimental volumizing treatment into a frizzy, untamable halo that made her look like an electrified poodle. She stood in her kitchen, glaring out the window at her pristine delphiniums while waiting for the kettle to boil, when a sharp, aggressive rapping echoed from her front door. Agatha frowned, pulled her silk dressing gown tighter around herself, and stomped down the hallway. She yanked the door open, prepared to unleash a blistering tirade upon whoever had dared disturb her morning routine before her first caffeine injection. Standing on her porch was Detective Constable Bill Wong. He looked thoroughly miserable, his raincoat glistening with raindrops, holding a brown paper evidence bag. But what made Agatha's breath catch in her throat wasn't Bill's damp uniform. It was the object inside the bag. It was a silver-plated cigarette case, engraved with the initials R. Agatha stared at it, her mind momentarily freezing. "Where did you get that?" Bill sighed, rubbing a tired hand across his forehead. "Morning, Agatha. I was hoping you'd explain that to me. We found it late last night tucked underneath the smashed shards of the Ming vase in Sir Gerald's study." Agatha felt the blood drain entirely from her face, instantly replaced by a hot, furious surge of defensive adrenaline. "That is ridiculous. I dropped my cigarette case last week, during the Open Gardens Day when I rushed into the hallway after the scream. Anyone could have picked it up and dropped it by the safe." "Did they?" Bill asked softly, his gentle brown eyes filled with an uncomfortable mixture of professional duty and genuine pity. "Because Mrs. Hodges swears she saw you lingering near the study corridor 5 minutes before she found the room wrecked, and now this turns up right next to the empty safe. Mrs. Hodges is a senile old biddy who couldn't identify her own apron." Agatha shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet lane. "You cannot possibly believe I broke into a safe, Bill Wong. I am a respectable retired professional, not a common burglar." "I don't want to believe it, Agatha," Bill said, holding up a placating hand. "Chief Inspector Cummings is already breathing down my neck, and when he hears your engraved case was found at the scene of the theft, he's going to want to bring you in for questioning. I'm warning you as a friend, stay away from Croft Manor. Stay away from Julian. Stay away from Marcus. And for heaven's sake, stop investigating." Before Agatha could launch into another, even more ferocious defense, Bill turned on his heel, hurried down her gravel path, and got into his unmarked police car, leaving Agatha standing on her porch, trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed the door shut so hard, the stained glass transom shuddered. Someone had framed her. It wasn't just that her pride was bruised, though it was bruised to the point of structural failure. It was calculated, Someone in Carsley had deliberately taken her silver cigarette case, which she remembered leaving on the terrace table during the Tea Party chaos, and planted it by the safe to throw the police off their scent and pin the burglary squarely on her. Panic fluttered briefly in her chest, cold and sharp. She was a middle-aged woman living alone in a sleepy Cotswolds village, and the local police were inching toward treating her as a prime suspect in a felony theft and potential murder inquiry. If she sat back and waited, Cummings would slap handcuffs on her just to look efficient for the county press. She needed to act, and she needed to act now. By 11 o'clock, Agatha had forced herself into a semblance of icy composure. She dressed in her most formidable black trench coat, applied a layer of crimson lipstick so bright it looked like a threat, and marched out into the relentless drizzle. Her destination wasn't the manor this time. It was the local post office and general store, the true epicenter of Carsley intelligence. If anyone had seen someone swiping a silver cigarette case from the terrace table during the Open Gardens event, Mrs. Wong would know about it. As Agatha pushed open the bell-jingling door of the shop, the humid smell of loose tea, paraffin, and fresh bread washed over her. Mrs. Wong looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening behind her thick spectacles, like twin radar dishes, detecting incoming trouble. "Agatha," Missy Wong chirped, her voice pitching up an octave. "You're out early in this dreadful weather. Terrible about the police car parked outside your cottage earlier, isn't it? The whole village is talking." Agatha leaned both hands on the wooden counter, pinning the postmistress with a glare so fierce it could have melted chocolate. "Cut the innocent act, Mrs. Wong," Agatha hissed, her voice low and lethal. "Someone who stole my cigarette case from the manor terrace and planted it in Sir Gerald's study. Now, since nothing happens in this parish without you cataloguing it in your mental ledger, who was standing near my table on Saturday afternoon?" "Missy." Wong swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the sweet jars behind her, realizing that Agatha Raisin had officially crossed the line from village eccentric into a terrifying force of nature. Section 8. A second incident and a shifting game, an Agatha Raisin mystery. Missy Wong's eyes darted nervously from the jars of boiled sweets to Agatha's unblinking, furious stare. The postmistress swallowed hard, her fingers nervously pleating the hem of her cardigan. "Well," Mrs. Wong whispered, leaning over the counter as if sharing nuclear launch codes, "if you must know, I wasn't paying attention to the whole terrace, mind you, but I did see someone hovering near your handbag while you were inside fetching that second gin and tonic." Agatha's eyes narrowed to lethal slits. "Who?" "Marcus Vance," Mrs. Wong breathed. "He was talking to Julian Croft, but his eyes kept wandering toward your seat. Right after you left, he walked past your chair to grab a glass of lemonade. His hand brushed against your table, and when he walked away, I thought nothing of it. Until now." Agatha felt a cold spike of clarity cut through her anger. Marcus Vance, the landscape architect with the failing business, the massive unpaid bill, and the aggressive temper. It made brutal tactical sense. Marcus had spotted her cigarette case, realized how nosy and dangerous she was becoming, and saw a golden opportunity to redirect the police investigation straight onto the village's most outspoken busybody. "Thank you, Mrs. Wong," Agatha said tightly. She turned on her heel and marched out of the shop, letting the door slam shut with a sharp, metallic ring. The drizzle had turned into a steady, miserable downpour. But Agatha didn't care. Her raincoat shielded her clothes, and her mind was burning with a singular, vindictive purpose. Marcus thought he could frame Agatha Raisin and get away with it. He had severely underestimated the tenacity of a woman who had once managed PR crises for disgraced politicians and Hollywood starlets. She decided against confronting Marcus at his trailer again. That would be too predictable. Instead, she needed to find the missing black ledger, the legal notebook Sir Gerald had kept on his desk. If Marcus or Julian had stolen it, they would have hidden it somewhere close to their work sites or temporary lodgings. An hour later, Agatha found herself creeping along the perimeter wall of Croft Manor, using the thick, weeping willow trees as cover against the grey rain. Her destination was the old potting shed near the estate's grand greenhouses, a structure Marcus Vance had been using as a temporary tool depot during his landscaping overhaul. The shed sat quietly at the edge of the gardens, its wooden door padlocked. Agatha scanned the area. The grounds were entirely deserted, abandoned to the dreary weather. Right, Agatha muttered to herself, pulling a heavy gardening trowel she had grabbed from her porch out of her pocket. Let's see how well your locks stand up to a former Londoner, Mr. Vance. She wedged the flat edge of the trowel into the wooden frame of the door, planting her boots firmly in the wet mud, and gave it a violent heave. With a loud protesting crack, the rusty latch gave way, and the door swung inward, releasing a damp wave of fertilizer, diesel fumes, and old soil. Agatha slipped inside, pulling a small penlight from her pocket and sweeping the beam across the cluttered interior. Shovels, bags of grass seed, rolls of chicken wire, and stacks of architectural blueprints lined the walls. She began tearing through the clutter, tossing aside empty plant pots and rifling through cardboard boxes. Nothing, just landscaping receipts and brochures for decorative stone fountains. Frustration flared in her chest. Had she guessed wrong? Was the ledger somewhere else? She shone the light toward a workbench in the far corner. Beneath a pile of dirty overalls sat a heavy metal cash box. Agatha tried the lid. It was locked. Without hesitation, she raised her heavy gardening trowel and brought it down hard on the brass clasp. Clang! The clasp snapped open. Agatha lifted the lid, her breath catching in her throat. Inside wasn't money. It was a black leather, bound ledger, its pages filled with Sir Gerald Croft's spidery, arrogant handwriting. She flipped it open, scanning the columns of names, financial notes, and legal amendments. But as the beam of her penlight hit the center page, her blood ran cold. There was a fresh entry, dated just 2 days before Sir Gerald's death. It detailed a massive cash payout extorted from the estate. And the name attached to it wasn't Julian Croft, and it wasn't Doris. Before Agatha could read the name clearly, a heavy shadow fell across the open doorway of the shed. She whipped around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing in the frame, blocking her only exit, was Marcus Vance. His linen shirt was gone, replaced by a dark waterproof jacket, and in his hand he held a heavy iron wrench. His face was twisted into a dark, ugly smile of pure malice. Well, Mrs. Raisin," Marcus said smoothly, taking a slow step inside. "It seems curiosity really does kill the cat." Section 9. Agatha's Bold Gamble, an Agatha Raisin mystery. The air inside the damp potting shed suddenly felt thin and suffocating. Agatha stared at Marcus Vance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she forced her chin up, refusing to let the landscape architect see her panic. "You're trespassing on private estate property, Mr. Mast." "Vance," Agatha said, her voice steady and razor, sharp, masking the adrenaline flooding her veins. "And judging by this ledger, you're doing a lot more than just planting flowers." Marcus chuckled, a low, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. He stepped further into the shed, letting the heavy iron wrench dangle casually from his right hand. "Sir Gerald was a miserable extortionist," Marcus said, his smooth charm entirely stripped away, revealing a desperate, dangerous man beneath. "He found out about my previous business failures in Cheltenham. He used this ledger to trap me, forcing me to do heavy landscaping work for pennies, while threatening to ruin my reputation if I didn't comply. He was bleeding me dry." "So you decided to stop the payments permanently," Agatha retorted, her dark eyes locked onto his. "You broke into his study, stole the new will, took the ledger, and planted my cigarette case by the safe to throw the police off your scent. Very neat, Marcus. But murder over landscaping bills. I didn't kill him," Marcus snapped, a flash of genuine panic breaking through his cold exterior. "We argued, yes. I shoved him during our row on the lawn because he refused to pay for the stone masonry. He tripped over his own expensive rose bed and hit his head on a garden border stone. He was already dead when I walked away, but when I realized the new will and the ledger were in his study, I knew I had to get them before the police found out how deeply he was blackmailing me." Agatha processed the confession rapidly. It made a grim sort of sense, but it still didn't account for everything. Before she could press him further, Marcus took a menacing step forward, raising the wrench. "Hand over the ledger, Mrs. Raisin," Marcus hissed, And then we're going to have a little chat about discretion." Agatha didn't hesitate. With a burst of frantic energy, she grabbed a heavy bag of organic potting soil from the workbench and hurled it directly at his face. Marcus shouted in surprise, stumbling backward as a cloud of dark, damp peat exploded across his jacket and eyes. It was all the opening Agatha needed. She bolted past him, ducking under his outreached arm, and sprinted out of the shed into the steady Cotswold's drizzle. "Hey, get back here," Marcus roared from behind her. Agatha ran with a speed she hadn't managed since her school sports days, clutching the black ledger tightly to her chest. She vaulted over a low stone wall, scrambled down the muddy lane, and didn't stop until she slammed the front door of her cottage behind her, double-locking the deadbolt with trembling hands. Leaning against the wooden door, gasping for breath, she looked down at the ledger in her hands. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins, but a wild, triumphant grin was slowly spreading across her face. She had the evidence, but handing it quietly to Bill Wong and letting Marcus slip away into a legal loophole wasn't Agatha's style. If she wanted true vindication and a satisfying end to her humiliation, she needed a public stage. 2 hours later, Agatha executed her bold gamble. She called an emergency meeting of the Castley Ladies' Society, claiming she had urgent, breaking news regarding the Croft Manor mystery. Curiously and irresistibly drawn by the drama, the entire village elite, including Mrs. Bloxby, Margaret Darby, Julian Croft, and a bewildered Doris, packed into the village hall. Even Detective Constable Bill Wong, tipped off by a cryptic phone call from Agatha, stood near the back double doors, looking deeply skeptical. Agatha stood at the front of the hall, wearing her emerald blazer, her posture rigid, her hair defiantly styled. On the table before her sat the black leather ledger. "Thank you all for coming," Agatha announced, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the silent room. "I know you are all dying to know who broke into Croft Manor. For days, certain malicious tongues looking right at you, Margaret, have whispered that I was involved, but the truth is far more dramatic." She picked up the ledger and held it aloft. "The killer didn't just steal a will," Agatha declared, locking her eyes onto the back row where a damp, scowling Marcus Vance had just slipped into the room, hoping to blend in. "They stole a blackmail ledger. A ledger that proves Sir Gerald Croft was bleeding local contractors dry. And the man who did it, the man who argued with Sir Gerald, stole the documents and cowardly planted my cigarette case at the scene, is standing right over there." Every head in the room whipped around. Marcus froze, his face draining of colour as a dozen pairs of accusatory, village eyes locked onto him. Before he could turn to run, the back doors swung open wider, and 2 local police officers, alerted and backed by Bill Wong, stepped forward, blocking his exit. "Mr. Vance," Bill Wong said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs with a quiet sigh of relief, "I think you and I need to have a little chat." Section 10. The reveal and the return to normalcy, an Agatha Raisin mystery. The heavy click of steel handcuffs, snapping around Marcus Vance's wrists, echoed loudly through the silent village hall, sounding remarkably like the final drop of a guillotine. For a breathless second, nobody moved. The assembled members of the Castley Ladies' Society sat frozen in their folding chairs, their eyes darting back and forth between Marcus's thunderous, furious expression and Agatha Raisin, who stood behind the speaker's podium looking every bit the conquering general. Marcus wrenched his arms away from the 2 local constables. His face flushed a dark, mottled crimson. "This is an outrage," he snarled, glaring daggers at Agatha. "She broke into my shed. She stole that ledger. You can't pin an extortion charge on me based on the word of a hysterical, nosy, middle-aged woman with atrocious hair." Agatha flinched, her hand instantly flying up to defensively touch her frizzy dandelion. Textured locks, a hot flash of pure, unadulterated fury, eclipsed her triumph. For a split second, she looked ready to vault over the table and throttle him herself. "My hair is the result of an experimental volumizing treatment. You ungrateful vandal," Agatha shouted back, her voice ringing sharply across the hall. "And I didn't steal the ledger. I liberated it from your illegal cache before you could feed it to a woodchipper. Bill, read him his rights before I lose my temper and hit him with a folding chair." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the room at Agatha's casual violence, though Mrs. Mild Bloxby could be seen hiding a very small, appreciative smile behind her hand. Bill Wong sighed heavily, running a tired hand across his face. "Marcus Vance, you are being detained for questioning regarding the burglary of Croft Manor, the theft of estate documents, and potential extortion." "Anything you say," Bill paused, casting an apologetic glance toward Agatha, "will be written down and used against you." With a final venomous glare directed entirely at Agatha, Marcus was hauled away toward the exit, his boots scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. As the doors swung shut behind the police escort, the tension in the hall evaporated instantly, replaced by an explosive wave of frantic, high-pitched chatter. Half the room stood up at once, desperate to dissect every single detail of the drama. Margaret Darby, her face wearing an expression of profound, grudging shock, marched right up to the podium. "Well, Agatha," Margaret said, her tone a masterclass in awkward, backhanded concession, I suppose we owe you an apology. For a moment there, with the cigarette case and all, we genuinely thought you were the criminal mastermind." "I am many things, Margaret, but I am not a common burglar," Agatha replied coldly, leaning across the table and fixing her with a stare so sharp it made the older woman recoil. "And if I ever hear of you spreading rumors about my habits or my hair again, I will personally ensure your recipe is banned from the church bake sale for the rest of your natural life." Margaret swallowed hard, gave a stiff nod, and retreated into the safety of the crowd. Doris Croft pushed her way through the cluster of villagers, stepping up to the front table. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was an unmistakable lightness in her posture, as if a 40-year-old anchor had finally been cut loose. "Agatha," Doris said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "the police told me. They found a copy of the older, valid provisions in the safe Marcus ransacked. The estate isn't going to that Australian cousin. The legal team says my position as primary beneficiary, under the unrevoked terms, is secure." Agatha softened, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Good for you, Doris. Time you started living your own life, instead of running a museum for a tyrant." Doris smiled back, nodded gratefully, and walked away. Within 10 minutes the village hall had emptied out, leaving Agatha standing alone among the scattered folding chairs and abandoned teacups. The adrenaline was slowly draining from her system, leaving behind a profound, aching fatigue in her shoulders and lower back. She walked out of the hall into the fresh Cotswold's air. The drizzle had finally stopped, leaving the village streets washed clean and glistening under the late afternoon sun. As she strolled down the lane toward her cottage, she spotted James Lacey leaning against her garden gate. He was holding a bottle of expensive French gin he must have picked up from the local boutique, looking remarkably relaxed. Agatha slowed her pace, her heart doing its usual, irritating little flutter. "I heard the news," James said as she approached, holding up the bottle with a faint, wry smile. "Apparently, Carsley's most notorious detective has solved another case and humiliated the local constabulary in the process." "Bill Wong is a dear boy, but he lacks flair," Agatha retorted, lifting her chin as she unlocked her front gate. She marched up the path, pretending to ignore the way James fell into step beside her. "And I didn't solve it for fun. Someone planted my cigarette case. A woman has to protect her reputation." "Of course," James said smoothly, following her into the hallway as she pushed her front door open. "So, does this mean you're retiring from active sleuthing?" Agatha dropped her keys onto the hall table, turned around and looked up at him. The house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely her own. She was tired, her hair was still a disaster, and she was blissfully, fiercely content. "Don't be ridiculous, James," Agatha said, a sharp, wicked spark returning to her dark eyes as she reached for 2 glasses. "Spring is just around the corner, and you never know when someone in this village is going to commit a murder, simply to annoy me." Section 11. The Aftermath and the Uninvited Guest, an Agatha Raisin mystery. The following morning, Carsley returned to its usual deceptive brand of rural tranquility. The birds chirped with infuriating cheerfulness from the ancient oak trees. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across manicured lawns, and you would never have guessed that a local aristocrat had expired in a rosebed. or that a landscape architect was currently sitting in a police holding cell, answering very uncomfortable questions about extortion. Agatha Raisin sat at her kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee with a deep, purring sense of satisfaction. She wore her favorite silk robe. Her hair had finally recovered its sleek post-salon composure, thanks to a heavy-duty conditioning mask, and the Morning Post had brought a handwritten note of gratitude from Doris Croft that practically dripped with relief. For the first time in weeks, the world felt entirely right. She was just contemplating whether to spend the afternoon pruning her delphiniums or driving into Evesham to buy a completely different, non-lemon-coloured hat, when a sharp, authoritative pounding hammered against her front door. Agatha frowned, setting her coffee mug down with a clatter. Nobody knocked on her door with that kind of aggressive entitlement, except one person. She marched down the hallway, yanked the door open and stopped dead. Standing on her porch wasn't Bill Wong, and it wasn't James Lacey. It was a tall, impeccably groomed woman in her late 40s wearing an aggressively tailored navy pantsuit, diamond stud earrings, and an expression that could curdle milk at 50 paces. Agatha Raisin, the woman demanded, her voice cutting through the morning air like a surgical scalpel. Yes, Agatha said defensively, crossing her arms over her silk robe and narrowing her eyes. And you are Penelope Croft, the woman announced, stepping uninvited past Agatha into the hallway with the breezy confidence of an invading army. Sir Gerald Croft's primary legal representative and his long-suffering corporate counsel from London. I've just come from the manor, and the local police tell me you were heavily involved in recovering the missing estate documents. Agatha blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the sheer brass of her visitor. She closed the front door and followed Penelope back into the living room, her protective instincts instantly flaring. Involved is a rather mild word, Agatha retorted, leaning against her bookshelf. I essentially solved the case, while your local constabulary was still trying to figure out which end of a magnifying glass to look through. What do you want, Penelope? Penelope turned around, her sharp blue eyes scanning Agatha's cosy cottage with a look of mild clinical detachment before locking back onto her face. I want to talk about the ledger, Penelope said smoothly, and the new will amendments. Agatha's posture stiffened. The police have the ledger, and Doris has her rightful inheritance. Case closed. Not quite, Penelope said, walking slowly toward the window. Sir Gerald was a difficult man, Mrs. Raisin. Brilliant, but ruthless. Before he died, he deposited a confidential memo with my firm in London, a memo detailing a secondary property portfolio in the Cotswolds that was never registered under the main estate, a property currently occupied by someone under a false lease. Agatha stared at her, a cold, prickling sensation of intrigue, suddenly banishing all thoughts of gardening. A false lease? Whose property? Penelope turned, a faint, cryptic smile touching the corners of her lips. Marcus Vance's landscaping headquarters. The mobile trailer park isn't just a workspace. It sits on a prime piece of commercial land Sir Gerald intended to repossess the very day he died. The silence in the living room stretched, thick and heavy, as Agatha's mind raced backward, connecting a dozen previously invisible dots. Marcus hadn't just been angry about unpaid stone masonry. He was about to lose his entire livelihood and business operation overnight. So, Agatha murmured, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper, the argument on the lawn wasn't just about money. It was about an eviction. Precisely, Penelope said, picking up her leather briefcase. The police have the extortion angle, but my firm is handling the civil recovery, and frankly, Mrs. Raisin, given your uncanny knack for unearthing things people prefer to keep buried, I wanted to offer you a formal retainer, as a private consultant for the estate. Agatha stared at the polished corporate lawyer. A retainer, working for a high-end estate. It was a tiny echo of her old London PR days, a tantalizing bridge between her past life and her present village existence. She felt a slow, triumphant grin spread across her face. Carsley was never going to be quiet again, and Agatha Raisin wouldn't have had it any other way. Section 12, a toast to the detective and Agatha Raisin mystery. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow across the rolling Cotswolds, hills bathing Carsley in the kind of picturesque postcard serenity that made you almost forget about forgery, blackmail, and dead aristocrats in rosebids. Agatha Raisin stood before her full-length hallway mirror, inspecting her reflection with critical care. Her hair, having finally forgiven her for the disastrous experimental volumizing treatment, lay in a smooth, sleek, expensive-looking blonde bob that whispered effortless sophistication. She wore a tailored crimson-sheath dress that hugged her curves with defiant confidence, finished off with a discreet spritz of her favorite French perfume. Life was, for the moment, entirely under control. The village was quiet. Marcus Vance was cooling his heels in a police-holding cell, facing a battery of very serious charges regarding extortion and document tampering. Doris Croft was safely settling into her rightful inheritance at the manor, free from decades of psychological tyranny. And Penelope Croft's lucrative retainer offer sat proudly on Agatha's desk, a tangible validation of her unmatched investigative instincts. A crisp, polite rap sounded at her front door. Agatha took one last approving look at her reflection, smoothed down the front of her dress, and strode down the hallway. She threw the door open with theatrical flair. Standing on the porch was James Lacey. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal blazer and an open-collared white shirt, holding a chilled bottle of vintage champagne in one hand and 2 crystal flutes in the other. His grey eyes swept over her, taking in the crimson dress and the polished hair, and for a fleeting, wonderful second, his usual guarded expression melted into genuine, open admiration. "Good evening, Agatha," James said, his voice dropping into a smooth, warm register. "I trust Carsley's most formidable detective is off duty." "Depends entirely on whether anyone is currently committing a felony within a 5-mile radius," Agatha retorted, though her lips curved into a very pleased, self-satisfied smile. "Come in, James. Don't just stand on the porch like a village idiot." He stepped past her into the cozy hallway, the faint scent of cedarwood and crisp linen following in his wake. They walked through to the living room, where the French doors stood wide open to let in the cool evening breeze scented with blooming jasmine from the garden. James set the champagne and flutes down on the coffee table, deftly popping the cork with a satisfying pop that sent a tiny puff of white mist into the air. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into the 2 glasses, handing one to Agatha. "To the saviour of Croft Manor," James toasted, raising his glass with a wry, affectionate smile. "May the local criminals learn to fear your name." Agatha clinked her glass against his, the crystal ringing out clear and bright in the quiet room. "They already do, James. They already do." She took a long, delicious sip of the champagne, the cold bubbles dancing delightfully on her tongue. She settled back into her favorite armchair, crossing her legs with studied elegance, feeling the warm, comforting hum of triumph radiating from head to toe. Carsley was her village now. She had conquered the gossip, stared down the local gentry, outsmarted a desperate landscape architect, and proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Agatha Raisin was a force of nature to be reckoned with. "So," James said, taking a seat on the sofa opposite her, resting his arm along the back of the cushions, "Penelope Croft tells me you're officially consulting for the estate. Now, does this mean you're trading in gardening shears for a private investigator's license?" Agatha laughed, a rich, melodic sound that carried all the warmth of a woman completely comfortable in her own skin and her own brilliance. "Don't be absurd, James," she purred, leaning forward, her dark eyes flashing with a bright, mischievous spark. "A private investigator license is far too pedestrian. I am simply a woman who appreciates order, high standards, and a thoroughly good mystery." James shook his head, a fond, helpless smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Heaven help us all." "Indeed," Agatha agreed softly, taking another sip of her champagne as the sun dipped below the Cotswold's horizon, painting the evening sky in shades of amber and rose. "Heaven help us all."